The past week has once again been filled with more headlines related to the Microsoft and Activision Blizzard acquisition, as Phil Spenser makes some empty promises about Call of Duty on competitor services or devices, and attempts a verbal sleight of hand by insisting the acquisition is more about mobile than Call of Duty. Meanwhile, the European Commission has a lone employee causing trouble with a statement on social media. What, trouble on Twitter? Who would have thought? We'll be looking at how, if at all, these stories shake up the potential deal in today's video. Welcome back, gamers. Before we get into today's news, if you would do me a favor, smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't already to support the channel, and of course, leave any feedback, thoughts, or constructive criticism in the comments below. Now let's get into it. We're going to start off with an article coming from Video Games Chronicle, the title stating, Phil Spenser says he's open to committing to Sony that Call of Duty will stay on PlayStation longer term. And we're just going to read through some of the main highlights. Speaking on the Verge's Decoder podcast, Phil Spenser explained that he was open to making a commitment that would make Sony and global regulators happy. He's quoted here stating, This idea that we would write a contract that says the word forever in it, I think, is a bit silly, Spenser said, but to make a long-term commitment that Sony would be comfortable with, that regulators would be comfortable with, I have no issue with that. He goes on to say, we think Call of Duty will be on PlayStation as long as players want to play Call of Duty on PlayStation, and native Call of Duty on PlayStation, not linked to them having to carry Game Pass. Some of the last highlights we have in the article here are stating, in September, Spenser said Microsoft had committed to making Call of Duty available on PlayStation for several more years after Sony's current marketing deal with Activision expires. However, Sony International Entertainment CEO Jim Ryan, who is reportedly seeking access to future Call of Duty games on equal terms and in perpetuity, responded publicly by calling Microsoft's proposal for keeping the series on PlayStation consoles inadequate on many levels. Those are the main points from the article. But Phil Spenser's statements about being open to a longer commitment for Call of Duty on PlayStation does not include anything definitive and seems more like a response to Jim Ryan calling the prior Xbox proposal for Call of Duty on PlayStation inadequate on many levels. I suspect Phil Spenser and Xbox would prefer to have some written deal with Sony about Call of Duty being on PlayStation rather than separate countries' trade commissions proposing what would likely be a much more broad and restrictive consent decree or legal contracts concerning whether Call of Duty can be exclusive or even on Game Pass day one perhaps. So for them to try to get their biggest rival on their side while these trade commissions decide what, if any, restrictions will be placed on the acquisition just makes strategic sense and doesn't really change anything for the moment. We'll have to see if Sony responds to this, if at all. If Sony felt that they didn't have a shot at getting some kind of good consent decree, legally binding statements to include Call of Duty on equal terms on PlayStation for longer than probably what Xbox is willing to legally write out, then maybe they would go to Xbox if they didn't think this trade commission route was the way to go, but we'll just have to see. And addressing the talking point about no contract has forever written out in it, the contract does not have to state forever, but rather something like, for as long as Call of Duty remains within the top 3 best-selling games, the next iteration should not be withheld from rivals or placed on a dubiously sustainable subscription service that looks prone to predatory low-cost pricing. But given everything that's been said and walked back from, like how Call of Duty would stay on PlayStation, now definitively Xbox is saying that that's not going to happen forever. But still, people will take what these corporations say at face value, like how Phil attempts to downplay the importance of Call of Duty in the Activision Blizzard deal by saying it's actually more about the mobile market for them, essentially. And we're going to read a bit from an article coming from GameSpot.com that's titled, Phil Spenser says Activision Blizzard deal is focused on Candy Crush, not Call of Duty. I don't think he actually is quoted stating that, and I think it's actually from the same podcast, maybe. Yes, from the Verge's Decoder podcast. Just not quoted in the other article. But here he's quoted claiming that mobile gaming is seeing far higher growth than consoles or PC. He also admitted that Xbox has a minimal presence on mobile, as he's quoted stating, anybody who picks up their phone and decides to play a game would see that on their own. Meaning, I guess they don't have very many IPs on mobile currently. With that absence in mind, Spencer considers it urgent for Microsoft to make a presence in this space. He said, "If we are not about to find customers on phones, on any screen that someone wants to play on, are really going to get stagnated to a niche market of gaming, that running a global business will become very challenging. Basically, as mobile gaming grows and console gaming remains stagnant, the Microsoft's market share will shrink." He concluded that it's critical that if you're trying to run at a scale global gaming business, that you meet your customers where they want to play. And more, mobile is the place people want to play. He goes on stating, "The idea that Activision is all about Call of Duty on console is a construct that might get generated by our console's competitor," Spencer said. And just to pause there for a moment, he states that it's all about Call of Duty. I don't think PlayStation, which is their main rival and the main one having issues with this at the moment as far as competitors, I don't think PlayStation is saying it's all about Call of Duty, but that's the one they're focused on. That's the one that's going to impact them the most. And that's it for the main points in this article I wanted to bring our attention. But for instance, if the acquisition was not in large part about Call of Duty, then I'm sure Microsoft could attempt to purchase just the mobile section of Activision Blizzard or some other primarily mobile gaming company that would not require nearly $70 billion to purchase. Something like the Embracer Group buying those Western studios from Square Enix. They didn't buy all of Square Enix, they just got some studio. I'm sure Activision Blizzard would be at least open to the idea of selling just their mobile division. But as Phil Spenser said, that's not the only thing that the deal is about. So don't let this vague corporate PR language fool you. The deal is very much about obtaining the exclusive rights to Call of Duty to either remove from competitors' marketplaces or enable them to predatorily lower the cost of entry by placing Call of Duty day one upon release on Game Pass. To quickly address whether or not Game Pass is predatorily lowering the price for Call of Duty, essentially, I would point out that Call of Duty is not releasing on all subscription services on the first day of release, but they would be forced to do so because of Xbox's public stance on all first-party games being on Game Pass day one. If it was profitable to do something like that, then just all games would be on subscription services as soon as they release. But these companies who own these services pay a lot of money for particular games. Even if Xbox could pay to offset the cost of how much Call of Duty would lose by going on a subscription service, only Microsoft and Xbox could do that. And that's where the predatorily lowering cost comes into play, because they're not using revenue even from within Xbox alone. They're pulling revenue from Microsoft as a whole to offset these costs, if they were to do something like that and still claim that it's profitable. And you can be sure if Call of Duty is under Microsoft and on Game Pass day one, it will not be on any other subscription service if Microsoft has anything to say about it, because they want actual revenue and return on investment. And having to pay full price for Call of Duty on competing platforms is great advertisement for Game Pass, but one that I would argue would allow Xbox to stymie growth of all current and future rival streaming services or subscription services, to the point of granting Xbox monopoly power, which we discussed in a prior video. Does not require a literal monopoly for a company to be considered to have monopolistic powers, and these federal trade commissions actually do something about it to regulate them. And lastly, we're going to look at a tweet made by a member of the European Commission that has some people crying unfair bias against Microsoft. We have an article pulled up from Insider Gaming. It's titled "European Commission Responds to Accusations of Bias Over Microsoft Activision Merger." So this fellow, Ricardo Cardoso, tweeted, "The Commission is working to ensure that you will still be able to play Call of Duty on other consoles." And he has separately stating, "Including my PlayStation. Also on our list to do is update stock pictures," and he points to the picture that the EU Competition Commission, Merger Control Commission put out that has wired controllers. Not important. But the statement itself, people are specifically pointing to the statement, "my PlayStation," as for him having bias. Although if he had a PlayStation, he would literally refer to it as "my PlayStation," because if he owns anything, that would be his, and he would say it's mine. But that aside, this cry of unfair bias toward Microsoft caused the European Commission spokesperson Adriana Podesta, to put out a statement here. As you've correctly pointed out, Mr. Cardoso works in the Director General for the Internal Market and not in the Directorate General for Competition. Mr. Cardoso is not involved in the assessment of this transition. Furthermore, as indicated clearly in his Twitter profile, he tweets in a personal capacity, meaning his tweets don't speak for the entire European Commission. Now, I think the spokesperson responded adequately enough, but I'll talk about the angle of potential bias regardless. For one, I think some people making an issue about this tweet would still make the same argument about bias even if the My PlayStation part was not included. And that part comes second and is debatably less important than what was stated before, which is an all-encompassing other consoles, which includes future ones as well. Now let's say we have the worst case scenario in that Ricardo Cardoso, the tweeter, has some influence on the investigation. And this is not the case, but we're just gonna run with it. Well, this investigation has not just begun last week or even last month, but it has been nearly a year of investigation, and the European Commission is taking this to their more serious phase 2, which is not common, but neither is the size of this deal itself. What I mean to say is the Commission may have a case against Microsoft already. I would not call an opinion after nearly a year of investigation bias, especially against Microsoft, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, company in the world. Also, I don't think even if they had all the documents and evidence they thought they needed, that they would be able to bypass the current ongoing processes, timeframe windows. But this also allows them to be in no rush to obtain such evidence and documentation. So no, I don't think there is any case for bias against Microsoft in the European Commission at the moment, at least not from this one tweet. I'll end the video by stating I don't think anything has changed concerning the acquisition deal, in that Microsoft will likely be propositioned by many of these trade commissions to sign a legal consent decree to ensure Microsoft does not participate in predatory below market pricing by placing the Call of Duty franchise in Game Pass on the first day of release, and probably that it will need to remain on competitors' consoles until Call of Duty does not take up such a large portion of the game sales market on a yearly basis. But that's just my assessment of the current situation. Let me know if you agree, or if you think I've overlooked any particular perspective to the deal in the comments below. Please consider liking the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't to support this kind of content, but most of all, thanks for watching Game Xfinity.